Today, I'm going to show you something a little different because a few videos ago, I reviewed a S550 Mustang GT, and in that video, I mentioned that I own a modified 800 horsepower Mustang GT. Now, a few people commented and asked when I'd review my own car, so here she is. I'm going to show you everything I've done to this beast, tell you what I've learnt along the way, and show you how she drives. And if you're new to the channel, my name's Nish, and this is The Word on Cars. Let me show you around what I think has turned out to be the perfect Mustang build. So, I've had my Mustang for the last 7 years and I've been modifying it from the day I picked it up. And now I find that this is the perfect setup for what I use this car for. What I wanted was a weekend car that was capable around corners, not just in a straight line, and something I could take out to the track or drag strip to have some fun. If you're looking to build a track or drag strip car to compete in though, this isn't the perfect setup for either of those. And if you're wondering what a setup like this costs after I tell you everything I've done to my Mustang, then stick around to the end. Now, before I show you around, I have to thank Mustang Mods and Mustang Motorsports here in Melbourne for making this car a reality. All of this started for me with Kevin and Damien and Mustang Mods, who did quite a few modifications from all of the visual upgrades to suspension and drivetrain changes. As the name suggests, they're Mustang specialists with a huge inventory of parts, so they know what they're doing. Mustang Motorsports, on the other hand, did all of the engine modifications on my car, and they've been in the business for a very long time. Craig, James and Glenn know what they're talking about when it comes to building performance Mustangs and are licensed to build Shelby products here in Australia. Iconic cars like the Shelby Super Snake. So a big thanks goes out to both Mustang Mods and Mustang Motorsports. They're top blokes and put up with my OCD when it comes to my car. So if you're ready to start modifying, make sure you check them out. Unlike my other videos, I'm not going to be doing a full review of everything this Mustang GT has, so check out my detailed review of the S550 Mustang GT by clicking the link in the description for that. Instead, I'm going to take you through all of the changes I've made to my car, starting with the styling. If you're not interested in the aesthetic upgrades but want to know how this drives with all of the modifications it has, then you can skip to the engine and driving section of the video. Now, most people seem to go straight for the GT500 or GT350 kits out there, which look great, but I've always thought that the greatest Mustang is the 1969 Boss 429. If you've watched any of the John Wick movies, you know what I'm talking about. So I wanted to pay homage to the Boss 429 and build a Mustang that was as close to a modern day version. Starting at the back, I opted for a Ford GT350 track pack spoiler, tail lamp housings from the refreshed S550 Mustang, which I prefer over the standard tail lamps, and a Ford GT500 diffuser, which meant I needed to replace the rear bumper bar with a post-refresh bumper, along with an upgraded LED reverse lamp housing and side markers. And tucked into the diffuser, we have a Corsa Extreme Catback exhaust. We'll come back to the exhaust later on. Over on the side, the Mustang rides on Shelby CS3 wheels, 9.5 inches on the front and 11 inches on the back. I will say that I wish the front wheels were ever so slightly wider because they do sit a little further in, but I was sold by the design and the fact that they're a Shelby American product. They're wrapped in Michelin Pilot Sport 4S tyres, 275s up front and 305s on the back. These tyres are brilliant and really help with handling and putting the power down. Behind the wheels, I'm still running the Performance Pack Brembo brakes that have been painted, which all Australian S550 Mustangs got. 6 calipers up front with vented 380mm discs and single pistons on the back with 350mm discs. For factory brakes, these things are massive. The Mustang also sits lower on Shockworks 2-way adjustable coilovers with damping, rebound and height adjustment. Stay tuned for all of the other suspension upgrades that I'll be telling you about a little later on. And this one might be a little controversial, but I opted to add these MP Concepts side intakes, which I think look sensational, even though they're not functional. As much as I'd love to have functional intakes, I'm not willing to cut into the rear quarter panel, so fake intakes it was. To finish off the side, the standard chrome 5.0 badges have been replaced with OEM blacked out badges. Then we have the hood. Now, most people think that this is a completely new hood, but it's not. After hours of research, I decided to go with this MMD V-Series hood scoop that bolts onto the factory hood, which doesn't actually have an opening to let air in. There's a couple of reasons I decided to go down this path. The factory hood is aluminium or aluminum, as some of you around the world may say it, so it's light compared to the fiberglass hoods that tend to be much heavier and prone to cracking. There are plenty of carbon fiber hoods out there, but I couldn't find a hood that I like the look of that integrated the wiper nozzles properly. That's my OCD kicking in. And with the fiberglass and carbon fiber hoods, you need to use hood pins to make sure the hood doesn't blow off when you're flying down the road. And having a hood with an opening might let more air in and out to keep the engine bay cool, but it also lets everything else in. So for all of those reasons, I chose the non-functional option for aesthetics. And as a finishing touch, I added this Coyote badge to the grille because under the hood, we have the 5-litre V8 Coyote engine. But this is no longer just an ordinary Coyote. Instead, this now has a 5th generation Whipple 3-litre supercharger strapped to it, which cranks out over 596 kilowatts and 813 Newton meters at the flywheel. And being a stage 2 kit, Whipple gives you everything you need to go from fast to insane. The kit includes a 132mm throttle body that can be upgraded to 150mm, a 6-rib belt which can also be upgraded to a 10-rib belt for higher power applications to reduce belt slip, a built-in air-to-water intercooler, 750cc Bosch injectors, a 415 litres per hour DW400 fuel pump, a heat exchanger with door fans, and everything else needed to get this kit installed. Aside from everything that came from Whipple, I also upgraded the oil pump gears and crankshaft timing sprocket for peace of mind while everything was pulled apart with Harrop billet gears. The standard parts are known to fail in higher power applications, which would basically destroy the motor. The oil cooler in these earlier Mustangs is also a weak point, and being a water-to-oil cooler, the common failure would cause oil and water to mix, which again would destroy the engine. So this one now has a Harrop air-to-oil cooler which works brilliantly, and unlike the factory oil cooler, keeps oil temperatures exactly the same even after a few hours of spirited driving. And just for good measure, while the oil cooler was going in, I installed a Shelby Extreme Duty radiator which manages water temperatures brilliantly. And lastly, to keep oil out of the air intake, the Mustang has a UPR catch can which collects any excess oil that would otherwise end up back in the engine. By the way, I chose not to install long tube headers even though the factory extractors are a little restrictive, but I can't tell you how many comments I've read on forums with people having clearance issues or melting ancillaries around the headers, so to avoid that headache, I stuck to the factory headers. With everything under the hood, 800 horsepower is just the start. You can crank these motors up to 1000 horsepower with the factory internal components, but unless you're into setting lap times at the drag strip, 800 horsepower is more than enough for spirited weekend drives or the occasional day at the track. Plus, at 800 horsepower, you reduce the risk of breaking things. And if you're wondering what all of this sounds like at the tail end, I absolutely love the sound that this Corsa exhaust gives the Mustang. Just make sure you start it in quiet mode though, if you don't want to annoy your neighbors. And for anyone out there with an earlier Mustang that didn't have the active exhaust, you can get yourself the Corsa exhaust for the models with the active exhaust and install a couple of motors on a remote to open and close the valves, which is what I've done, and it quietens this thing down dramatically. Then we have the business end, which has a Savini front splitter. From what I've been told, these were designed for US spec cars with a different belly pan, so aren't exactly a direct bolt-on, but it's an easy fix with a few extra bolts. I've replaced the upper and lower grills, a US Ford lower grill with a Windjet upper grill, which really gives the front end that Boss 429 look with integrated daytime running lights and fog lights in the middle that are wired to the factory switch. I've also added the switchback shark gill daytime running lights into the factory headlamps. The Aussie cars didn't get this as standard, which I think gives the front end an even more aggressive look. Over on the inside, the changes are minimal simply because I like the interior of the Mustang. It looks good and it's pretty much what you expect in an American muscle car. Now, what I did change in here are the steering wheel and gear shifter. Starting with the steering wheel, and as much as I love the clean design of the factory wheel, I found the wheel itself to be a little too thin, so out with the old and in with this carbon fiber wheel, which is much thicker and surprisingly very grippy. The shifter, on the other hand, was perfectly fine, but nothing says American muscle like a cue ball shifter, so this one's now rocking a Ford Performance shifter, which doesn't just look fantastic, but feels just as good. From a performance perspective, the shifter assembly has been swapped out for an MGW race spec short throw shifter, which comes in standard or X spec with a few different throw options, and unlike other shifter upgrades, replaces the entire assembly that connects to the transmission. So, that's everything on the inside. Time to get on the road and show you what this beast is really all about. So, driving my Mustang GT. This thing is an absolute animal, and I absolutely love it. Now, the Coyote out of the box is a fantastic motor. You get over 400 horsepower at the flywheel. It's rev happy. It's brilliant. Strap a supercharger on though, like I have, and it becomes something completely different, full of personality. It's really hard to describe how angry and violent this car can be, because when you do put your foot into it, regardless of what gear you're in, you could be cruising in fifth like I am right now, put your foot into it, and it just says, okay, master, let's go. And I love that. This car to me is the definition of American muscle. I mean, it's ridiculous. You've got more than double the amount of horsepower that you would get out of the box, or thereabouts, at the flywheel. And when you put that power down, this thing just shifts the weight onto the back wheels. The nose lifts up ever so slightly, and it just gets you going. It definitely gets you going. This thing is thrilling and exciting and scary all at once. It's quite ridiculous is the only way to put it. Now, the best thing about this Whipple kit though is it's got power, but it's the fact that it's drivable. You could drive this around every day without really even tapping into the 800 horsepower, and it drives fairly normally. I mean, good luck trying to drive this thing without putting your foot into it, because it's so addictive. You just want to keep putting your foot into it, but you can. It's just so drivable. You can just cruise around and not really even know what you have under the foot until you actually put your foot into it. And I think that makes this one of the best kits out there that you can buy for the Mustang. Now, you do need to change the way you drive this car though, because stepping into a supercharged Mustang, if you've been in a standard Mustang, there is a lot of power under your right foot. So it's not a point and shoot car. You can't just get in and floor it, because like any other animal, it'll listen to you, but push it too far, it'll bite back. So you definitely need to change the way you drive the Mustang with a supercharger strapped to it. I mean, any car with 800 horsepower, that's rear wheel drive, you definitely need to be paying attention when you're behind the wheel of this thing. You need to be focused, you need to actually exercise skill. It's not just a matter of getting in and driving. I love that about this car. It's one of the reasons I think it's one of the last proper analog sports cars that people can actually afford. And for anyone that's wondering what the fuel consumption in the Mustang's like now, post supercharging, it's not great. Now, out of the box, Ford claims that the Mustang with a 6-speed manual gearbox has about a 13.1 litre per 100 kilometre fuel consumption, which isn't great. The post-refresh models managed to get that down to 13 litres per 100 kilometres, which again isn't a huge difference. With the supercharger, I find this average is about 15 to 16 litres per 100 kilometres, which, to be honest with you, is pretty good considering how much power you have on tap in this thing. I mean, you can just go, go, go. Now, if you were daily driving this car, you're going to spend a lot of money on fuel. So I drive this car on the weekends. It's my weekend toy, and for that, it's perfectly fine. It works great, and I think most people with a supercharged Mustang, just purely based on the price of fuel, will probably end up weekending this car, which I think makes complete sense. So fuel consumption wise, if you were wondering, that's where we're at, 15 to 16 litres per 100 kilometres on average. Then we have the 6-speed manual transmission in this, which is the MT82. Now, you could go and drop a Tremec into this. Ford included the Tremec TR3160 in the Mark I and GT 350 variants, which is known to be a fantastic gearbox and much better than the MT82. Anyone with a GT can install the Tremec Magnum XL, which can handle up to 700 pounds-feet of torque, which is perfect for supercharged or turbocharged GTs. But that's going to cost you north of 20,000 Australian dollars. I think this works perfectly fine. It transfers power into the back wheels without any dramas. The issue with the MT82, like I mentioned in my review of the Mustang GT a few months ago, is the fact that it isn't refined. It is clunky, it's got its own quirks, and you do need to work out how it operates and drive based on that. And when you work that out, it works okay. Now, I have dropped an MGW race spec short throw shifter into this, like I mentioned, and that's transformed the way this feels, because not only does it reduce the throw distance longitudinally, it also reduces the throw distance laterally. I found when I first got this installed that I'd go from second to fifth quite often because it is so close. but you get used to that. And I think the feel is brilliant. Excuse me for a moment while I put my foot into it. But like I was saying, the feel's brilliant. It does make gear changes a lot more purposeful, a lot more precise. So I think it's one of the best investments you can make if you're buying a manual transmission Mustang, because it really does transform the way it operates. Now, clutch-wise, still running the factory clutch. Again, that works fine. I haven't felt any slip, nor have I had any issues with it. So I'm going to keep that in here for the time being. And when it's ready to be replaced, I'll put something that's a bit more high performance oriented. But the clutch is perfectly fine for the 800 horsepower this thing currently has. I have also changed the clutch line with a braided clutch line. Now, from a feel perspective, the clutch pedal feel in the Mustang has always been fantastic, to be completely honest. I like the way it feels because it's firm, yet not too hard and not too soft. I did feel a slight difference in terms of responsiveness with that change, but I wouldn't say it's had a significant impact on the actual pedal feel. Like I said, the clutch feels pretty good out of the box in these things. So overall, from a transmission perspective, very little changes here to accommodate the 800 horsepower, and everything works really well. Now, driveline wise, I've stuck to the factory drive shaft in this, purely because what you find in the aftermarket, there tend to be one-piece drive shafts, whereas the factory drive shaft is a two-piece drive shaft. And the aftermarket drive shaft being one piece tend to increase NVH, or noise, vibration, and harshness. So I've opted to stick to the factory drive shaft, which works fine. It puts the power down without any issues. It is a little bit heavier. Obviously, if you are taking this down to a drag strip and you want to set the best time possible, you probably want to go down the path of getting a lightened drive shaft. Those that are carbon fiber or aluminium. Now, the one thing to remember though is with carbon fiber drive shafts, when they fail, they essentially just explode. There's plenty of videos on YouTube of people at the drag strip just blowing these things up on launch. That aside, I mean, I'd probably go for an aluminium drive shaft because it does give you peace of mind. You're not going to get stuck somewhere because your drive shaft exploded under you. But factory drive shaft works fine, no issues, puts the power down without any problems. And it's the same thing with the half shafts. I'm still running the factory Ford half shafts on the back, and they work perfectly fine with the amount of power this car has. You don't run into risks of breaking those because on standard tires, I'm running Michelin Pilot Sport 4S's. The worst that's going to happen is you'll light up the tires, so you're not going to break anything. All that power gets just transferred into the wheel spinning. Now, if you do stick drag radials on the back, tires that are a stickier compound, then there is a good chance that you might break these because they're not really rated to take this much power. So if that's your thing, I suggest getting some upgraded half shafts, and the aftermarket's full of those. But for someone that's using this car on the weekends for some spirited driving, running this on standard tires, these things are perfectly fine. From a suspension perspective, I mentioned I'm running Shockworks two-way adjustable coilovers, and they work really well. They're designed in Australia, they're built in Australia, so they're perfect for Australian standards. Now, I have that set at the midpoint, so it's not too stiff and it's not too soft. I think it's the perfect balance, it's firm. And on a freeway or a highway, they're quite comfortable, to be honest. I actually don't find long journeys in this car to be uncomfortable as some may expect it to be. It does sit lower as well. And you know, on back roads like this, you definitely feel the road surface. You definitely also hear a couple of rattles and creaks here and there, just because it is a bit stiffer than the factory setup. And in factory guys, the GT is actually quite a comfortable car. The suspension's actually quite compliant. And again, a little bit firmer, but a lot more comfortable than this is. But when you are putting down 800 horsepower, you want your suspension to actually be able to handle that power and put it down, but also go around corners, because really there's no point otherwise. I'm not about straight line speed in this car. For me, it is about going around the twisties and having a bit of fun, and the suspension has really, really helped dial that in. In terms of other changes that I've made to the suspension, I've got a BMR front K-brace just to stiffen up the front end, and that's really helped with the steering feel and responsiveness as well, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. I have white line front and rear sway bars with end links, and they are a lot beefier than the factory sway bars, and they help keep this thing flat around corners. I mean, it's quite impressive how flat it stays when you are pushing this thing around a corner. Now, the one thing that I have noticed with those sway bars though is that because they're so stiff, when you are going up a steep driveway, you will find that one of your wheels is going to be up in the air. But small price to pay, and to be honest with you, it's not that much of a big deal. My only advice is though, is make sure that if you are changing your rear diff, make sure it's something that can still transfer traction to at least one of your wheels so you don't get stuck. I'm also running BMR cradle lockouts in the back. Now, these earlier Mustangs suffer from what is called wheel hop. And essentially what happens is that when you try to put the power down to the ground, it just can't gain traction because there's just far too much movement in the rear subframe. So BMR's come up with this ingenious idea which locks that out and keeps the subframe in place, and it is truly one of the best upgrades that any Mustang owner can make to their cars. To be honest, I think it is a mandatory upgrade because it really helps with putting the power down to the ground. Before I got these installed, I struggled. This thing would just hop every time I put my foot into it, but once I got them in, it completely eliminated wheel hop. And now, even with 800 horsepower, this thing just puts power down at the ground without any problems at all. So I couldn't recommend it highly enough. And yeah, there are a few manufacturers out there that are doing similar kits, but I swear by the BMR kit, they work fantastically. And while we're on the back end, I've also replaced the vertical links in the back because the factory vertical links are just stamped steel, so they deflect, they're not very strong, and there is a bit of movement in the back end because of that. So I've got BMR vertical links in there. They're chunky, just like the sway bars, very strong, and they keep the back end nice and tight and pulled together. And lastly, I have BMR toe links in the back that are adjustable, along with a Steeder camber adjuster. Now, the BMR toe links, they're brilliant because they are heavy duty compared to what the Mustangs came out of the factory with. So they work really well along the vertical links just to keep everything together. And like I said, they're adjustable. So when it comes to setting your geometry and tracking, they're perfect. So have all these changes really made that much of a difference? Absolutely. I mean, this thing with its upgraded suspension is a completely different beast now compared to a stock Mustang GT, which out of the box wasn't too bad when it came to handling, but it doesn't compare to this. This thing is a corner carver. It gives you so much confidence when you're entering into a corner. It just grips. It keeps you in place. It stays level, stays flat. I've got mates who drive all-wheel drive cars that always give the Mustang a bit of a hard time, but even they are completely shocked by how well this thing performs. So yeah, it makes a big difference. Now, Mustangs aren't universally known to have the greatest steering rack out there because, let's face it, they don't have the greatest feedback, front-end responsiveness isn't the greatest either, and there is a little bit of vagueness, but I must say, I think the changes that I made to the suspension in this car have actually improved some of those things. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not perfect, but you do get a little bit more feedback. It does communicate a little bit more in terms of what the front wheels are doing. I mean, the Mustangs always change directions quite quickly. So all in all, I think the steering is perfectly fine when you're running 800 horsepower. And as I showed you before, going around corners in this thing, it handles so well. And I think the steering does contribute to that. I think the suspension's carrying most of the weight there, but the steering works fine. And lastly, we have the brakes. Now, like I said, I'm still running the Performance Pack Brembo brakes in this thing, which for factory brakes are massive. And they work really well. They bring this thing to a stop on a dime. Even coming in and out of corners, the pedal feel is fantastic. Admittedly, I do have some Steeder braided brake lines in this, and they do improve the pedal feel ever so slightly and the responsiveness. But even without those, the standard Performance Pack brakes are fantastic, even with 800 horsepower. Now, there is a bit of a misconception though that people think more power means you need bigger brakes, and that's not necessarily the case. There are really 3 reasons why you would upgrade the brakes. One being big changes to weight or changes to unsprung mass of a car. So if you're adding bigger wheels and changing the weight quite significantly, you would need bigger brakes because stopping distance and braking power really all comes down to the weight of the car. And at 1,700 kilograms, these Brembos are perfectly suited to this car. Second reason would be track time. Now, if you're going down to the track occasionally, these brakes should be okay, as long as you take care of them, warm them up, and cool them down at the start and end of the track day. But if you're going to be spending a lot of time at the track, then you might want to think about getting some better discs and some better pads. Last reason is just aesthetics. because I've seen many Mustangs out there with GT 350 brakes, which cost a hell of a lot of money. They're massive compared to the performance pack brakes, but some of these cars are never going to see a track. So they're the real 3 reasons why you would upgrade the brakes on a car. The Mustang brakes though, they're perfectly fine. Like I said, it doesn't make a difference that this thing has 800 horsepower. When it comes to stopping, when it comes to going around corners, these brakes work brilliantly. At this point, you're probably wondering how much all of this craziness costs. Now, I've spent around 80,000 Australian dollars over the years on top of the cost of the car, and some of you might be thinking that that's a lot of money. If you live in the US, expect to pay a lot less because shipping and taxes here in Australia increases the cost significantly. And yes, it is a lot of money, but let me ask you this. What else can you buy for that kind of money that offers Lamborghini and Ferrari levels of power while being able to handle the way this thing does? The Mustang is then one of the greatest underdogs of our time because it puts ridiculous levels of power and performance in the hands of the working class. Cars like mine give a whole new meaning to being a dark horse. If you enjoyed the video and want to see more reviews like this, please like, share, and consider subscribing to the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next video.